I saw the footprints that night. They came out of the grave and went back in again.
Have you ever stopped to think about what it would feel like if, walking alone in a silent cemetery, you suddenly came across human footprints leading from a recently closed tomb? The mere thought sends a shiver down your spine, because deep down, we all know that death is an insurmountable boundary, a line that should never be crossed. But what if that line were broken before your eyes, on a night when the darkness seemed denser than usual? This question has never left my mind since the day I had an experience that forever changed the way I view death and those who rest beneath the earth. In that cemetery, where each grave carries stories of pain, farewells, and secrets never revealed, I learned to respect the absolute silence of the graves. What frightened me wasn't the weight of loneliness or the cold wind blowing between the tombs, but rather the idea that perhaps the silence of death wasn't as absolute as I'd always imagined. Some believe the dead rest in peace. Others believe their souls wander, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare me for the sight I saw before that tomb, still marked by fresh earth. I had never considered the possibility that the earth might hold signs of movement, as if someone within had struggled to escape. And yet, when my eyes met those marks on the ground, my heart raced in a way I had never felt before. Most disturbingly, those footprints weren't entering the grave, but rather emerging from it, as if death had momentarily lost control. And that was exactly where it all began, on a night that seemed ordinary, but that would soon show that the impossible can manifest itself in a cruel and silent way. Like and subscribe now, because what you've heard is just the beginning. Future stories will bring even more disturbing revelations that cannot be ignored. That night, the cemetery seemed to breathe on its own, as if every twisted tree and worn stone held a secret no one dared reveal. It was a small American town, the kind where everyone knows each other by name and where the cemetery is more than a resting place. It's a constant reminder that life can end at any moment. The iron gate creaked every time the wind blew past, and the sound echoed across the empty lot like a warning that even here, surrounded by tombstones, the silence was never complete. I had been working as a gravedigger for a short time, still trying to get used to the weight of the job. It wasn't a job many aspired to, but there was a strange dignity to it, as if it were my duty to care for the dead and ensure they lay in repose. Most days, this routine meant nothing more than dealing with the weight of shovels, the damp smell of the earth, and the suspicious looks of people who preferred not to approach those who spent so many hours beside death. I was young, perhaps too naive, and I still believed the cemetery was simply a place of silence and memories. But that night, as I walked among the dew-shrouded graves and watched the moon reflect off ancient crosses, something in the air felt different, heavier, denser. It was as if the darkness itself had gained consistency, seeping into my lungs and forcing me to realize that something wasn't where it should be. And this feeling, increasingly suffocating, began to become reality when I remembered the burial that had taken place just a few hours before. That same afternoon, I had attended the funeral of a man highly respected in the community, someone who, in life, carried a imposture of silent authority, the kind that dispensed with words to command respect. The procession was slow, marked by the muffled sound of sobs, the murmur of prayers, and the weight of goodbyes that lingered in the air. People moved in silence, some holding flowers, others simply observing in silence, as if their very presence were their final form of tribute. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, I noticed the detail of the clothing chosen for that final moment. An impeccable dark suit, a watch gleaming discreetly on his wrist, and shiny new shoes that still reflected the pale late afternoon light. It was as if the family wanted him to descend to earth, bearing the same image of dignity he maintained in life. When the ceremony ended and the family members left, only the fresh earth remained, carefully compacted so that nothing would betray the movement that had occurred there. For me, it was just another burial, another routine fulfilled, another night in which I could walk peacefully through the cemetery, expecting nothing but silence and darkness. However, this normalcy was shattered when, a few hours later, during my solitary rounds, I realized that the earth in that grave was no longer as I had left it. It was as if something had stirred the ground from within, and the simple idea began to creep through my mind like a shadow growing out of control. As I walked down the cemetery's central alley, lit only by a dim moon hidden between heavy clouds, I sensed something about the landscape didn't quite match the familiarity I'd built over the past few months of work. The ground was covered in a thin layer of dew, and each step I took made the damp grass crunch under my boots. But it was as I approached the newly closed grave that I noticed a disturbing detail. The earth wasn't smooth and level as I'd left it, but rather uneven, with small ripples that resembled the marks of something moving within. I leaned in slowly, trying to believe it was simply a compaction error, but the more I looked, the more I realized those marks had a pattern impossible to ignore. The wind blew hard, making the trees groan as if lamenting something I didn't yet know, and in that instant a shiver ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the feeling that this patch of land hid a secret that shouldn't be revealed. The silence around me became suffocating, interrupted only by the fluttering of a raven's wings, taking flight from a nearby cross, as if it too had noticed the anomaly before me. With every passing second, my mind insisted on searching for logical explanations. Perhaps animals had moved, perhaps the rain had shifted the earth, perhaps it was just my imagination playing tricks on me on a tiring night. However, when I bent down and ran my hand over the damp soil, I realized the marks weren't random, but organized, as if someone had actually pressed from the inside out. And it was at that moment that the darkness around me seemed to close. In even more, as if the entire cemetery was silently waiting for me to discover what was about to change my life forever. As the pale moonlight pierced a gap in the clouds, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten, as if crushed by an invisible hand. They weren't just random marks in the earth, but footprints, clear, well-defined footprints that began exactly where the grave had been filled hours before. What was most disturbing was the clarity of their contours. Elongated toes, the curve of the heel, the weight marked by the sinking into the still damp clay. They were bare feet, belonging to someone who seemed to have risen from the grave and walked with slow steps, as if they had just awakened from a deep, heavy sleep. My eyes followed the sequence of marks and realized they didn't spread out in various directions, but rather followed a single, straight, determined path toward the cemetery's main gate. Each footprint was like an open wound in the ground, betraying a movement that shouldn't have been possible. My heart pounded as a cruel memory forced itself upon me. That man had been buried wearing new, carefully polished shoes, placed there by his own family so he could descend into the earth with dignity. How, then, could I be standing before marks that revealed bare feet, covered only by the cold, early morning mud? At that moment, I felt reality begin to distort, as if I had crossed an invisible border between the world of the living and a territory where rules no longer made sense. Every detail of those footprints was a silent cry of something beyond comprehension, and yet, instead of pulling away, I felt a strange force pulling me closer, as if I were compelled to discover where those marks would take me. And it was in this conflict of fear and fascination that I began to understand that the real torture was not just in what I saw before me, but in what I could still find if I had the courage to follow that impossible trail. For a few seconds, I stood motionless before those footprints, as if my body had lost the ability to react, while my mind fragmented into 1,000 contradictory thoughts. My rational part screamed at me to move away, to leave that cemetery immediately and seek help. But there was another force, dark and insidious, pulling me back to the disturbed ground, as if the very silence around me demanded that I face the truth hidden beneath the earth. My breath came out raggedly, growing shallower, and I realized my hands were shaking, not just from the early morning cold, but from the psychological weight of accepting that perhaps I was facing something I should never have witnessed. I knelt again, letting my fingers sink into the still, damp clay, and felt the fresh, soft earth, as if it had been turned over minutes before. The strong smell of damp and decay mingled with the wind that swept through the field of graves, bringing with it a barely perceptible melody, like a whisper drifting between the ancient tombstones. My heart pounded in my chest, and with each beat the same question arose. Should I call the police and report the impossible, risking ridicule, or should I keep the secret to myself, pretending nothing had happened? My mind desperately searched for logical explanations, but none of them could resist the simple fact that the deceased's shiny shoes were still buried underground. The only remaining explanation was the one I most feared admitting. Something had left that grave, and that something had no need for shoes. It was in this whirlwind of fear and fascination that a decision began to form, slowly and inevitably, because even with all the terror that dominated me, there was within me a morbid need to know where those footprints would lead me, as if the truth hidden at the end of that trail was stronger than any instinct for self-preservation. I took a deep breath, trying to control the despair that threatened to overwhelm me, and decided I couldn't simply turn my back on those marks that defied all logic. Each footprint imprinted on the earth seemed to beckon me, as if a hidden message were etched into the damp clay, a silent summons demanding to be deciphered. I took the first hesitant step, listening to the muffled sound of my own boots sinking into the sodden ground, and realized the sound echoed strangely, as if absorbed by the cemetery rather than dissipating into the air. The wind had died down, the insects' chirping had ceased, and even the crows that usually fluttered in the nearby trees had disappeared, leaving an absolute emptiness that made every movement all the more suffocating. As I walked forward, I noticed that the footprints formed a linear path, firm, almost determined, as if whoever left them was fully aware of where they were going. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was following not just marks on the ground, but a kind of trail left deliberately, as if someone or something wanted to be followed. The sound of my footsteps mingled with the rapid beating of my heart, and with every meter I covered, my mind wavered between the urge to flee and the need to continue, as if I had become a prisoner of the very morbid curiosity that has always haunted my profession. When I finally realized the main gate wasn't so far away anymore, I felt a pang of relief, as if the footprints would lead me out of that place, returning me to the safety of the sleeping city. However, as soon as I raised my flashlight and looked more closely, my blood ran cold. The footprints didn't go through the gate as I'd imagined, but instead led into an old section of the cemetery, where moss-covered graves and broken crosses seemed to hold secrets forgotten decades ago. And it was there, faced with that unexpected detour, that I realized that the true revelation was yet to come, and that perhaps what awaited me was not just another mystery, but something that could mark me forever. I followed the detour, increasingly immersed in a forgotten part of the cemetery where vegetation seemed to grow unchecked and the air carried a sweet scent of ancient decay mixed with the moss covering the stones. The footprints remained firm, sunk into the mud, as if someone or something had walked purposefully to that point. And then, suddenly, they ceased. They didn't diminish in intensity. They didn't disperse in various directions. They simply stopped before an ancient grave, whose headstone now barely allowed the carved name to be read. The silence became so profound that even my breathing seemed profane in that moment, as if I were interrupting a secret that should never be revealed. I approached slowly, observing the moss covering the stone and the moisture seeping through the cracked marble. It was as if the footprints had been swallowed by the tomb itself, as if whatever had emerged from the newly filled grave had walked only to visit another dead person and then returned to its resting place. But the detail that most haunted me was noticing that the earth in front of this grave also seemed slightly disturbed, as if it were in a state of suspended motion. A chill ran through every fiber of my body, and I understood there were no answers, only the certainty that something there did not obey the rules of life or death. I turned my eyes to the darkness around me and realized I would never walk through that cemetery the same way again. Because after that night, I understood that some dead don't rest. They just wait. Have you ever wondered what you would do if, in the middle of a rainy dawn, walking alone through a cemetery, you noticed fresh footprints emerging in the sodden mud between the graves? Perhaps, at first, your mind would try to find a simple explanation, like the presence of someone sneaking in, but that sense of normalcy would immediately dissolve upon realizing that those marks didn't lead to a gate or an exit, but rather to a grave you yourself had seen closed the day before. Now imagine discovering that those same footprints, so clear and so real, not only left the grave, but returned to it, as if something had been forcibly torn from its eternal sleep and then returned to the same place, unable to remain in peace. This is the memory that still haunts me today, the scene that resurfaces in my thoughts when the rain falls heavily and the wind drags through the night. I had witnessed many strange things during my time as a gravedigger, but nothing could compare to what I saw that early morning, because these were not stories told by others, nor legends that circulated through the city, but something my own eyes had beheld, something that left invisible scars I have never been able to erase. The weight of that vision silently follows me, like a shadow that cannot be dispelled. And each time I recall the details, I feel the same chill run down my spine, as if I were still standing before that grave. And that was exactly how the dawn that changed my life began. A night in which the rain seemed to hide secrets, and in which the darkness revealed what should never have been seen. Like and subscribe now, because what you've heard is just the beginning. Future stories will bring even more disturbing revelations that cannot be ignored. That dawn felt different from the moment I set foot in the cemetery, as the rain fell insistently, heavily, each drop echoing like a muffled drum against the marble and granite headstones. Thunder crashed in the distance, briefly, illuminating the endless line of crosses stretching beneath the cloak of darkness. And with each flash of lightning, I felt shadows move subtly among the graves, as if they weren't truly attached to the ground. The wind blew cold, cutting my face like invisible blades, bringing with it the scent of wet earth and old flowers that, drenched by the water, gave off an even more intense and heavy odor. The cemetery in that small American town had always been a silent place, but under the rain and the weight of the dawn, it seemed to have taken on a life of its own, breathing like a sleeping creature dreaming of its dead. With each step, the clay crumbled beneath my boots, creating noises that blended with the rhythm of the storm, and this fusion of sounds produced a disturbing soundtrack, as if each crackle of the ground were a muffled response coming from beneath the earth. It was impossible to ignore the suffocating atmosphere that formed around me, as if the atmosphere itself conspired to remind me that I was not alone, even though my eyes insisted on finding no one. And it was in this scenario of incessant rain, howling wind and thunder that resounded like war drums that I realized that my nocturnal routine was about to be broken, because the silence between the flashes seemed to hold something that called me ever closer to the heart of the cemetery. Working as a gravedigger at night was never easy, but over time I learned to accept silence as an inseparable part of my routine. While the city slept safely, I walked among tombs, checking to see if the gates were locked, if the wind hadn't blown over freshly laid flowers, or if some animal hadn't invaded the grounds seeking shelter. It was solitary work, but somehow it held a strange dignity, for I was the guardian of the dead, the one who remained awake to ensure their rest was undisturbed. Each dawn, I repeated the same steps, knowing every curve of the alleys, every shadow cast by ancient trees, and every cross that rose against the night sky as if they were familiar landmarks of a world I alone inhabited. That rainy night, however, something seemed to erode this sense of familiarity. The incessant raindrops falling from the sky turned the ground into a broken mirror, reflecting the lightning in distorted fragments. And this sight gave me the impression that I was walking in a strange, almost unrecognizable territory. Even accustomed to solitude, I began to feel a growing unease, as if my eyes were being watched with every movement, and this uneasiness made each step heavier. I knew that soon I would complete my rounds and return to the small guardhouse to await dawn, but that night, the cemetery seemed to conspire against my routine, as if determined to reveal something that should never have been seen. And this feeling that something abnormal was hiding under the veil of rain was confirmed when, as I illuminated the path with the flashlight, my eyes came across marks in the mud that could never have been there. As the dim beam of the flashlight cut through the curtain of rain, I noticed something that, at first glance, seemed merely an imperfection in the sodden ground. But as soon as I took a few steps closer, reality brutally imposed itself. They were footprints, fresh marks imprinted in the dark mud that stretched before me like an unmistakable trail of movement. Every detail was there: the curve of the heel, the well-defined toes, the depth caused by the weight of someone walking barefoot in the storm. Most disturbingly, the rain had been falling steadily for hours, making it impossible for any mark to remain so clear if it had been left long ago. It was as if those footprints had been made moments ago, in a dawn when I should have been the only one alive walking among the dead. I leaned in to get a better look, and my heart raced as I realized there were no signs of entry or exit along the sides of the wall, nothing to suggest an intruder had invaded. It was as if the trail had appeared out of nowhere, sprouting from the center of the cemetery, created by feet that shouldn't have been there. The flashlight trembled in my hand, reflecting the inner turmoil I was trying to contain, while the sound of thunder seemed to reinforce the gravity of what my eyes were witnessing. The silence around me had become absolute, as if even the insects and nocturnal birds had ceased their sounds to listen to the unfolding of what was happening. I felt a deep shiver run down my spine, and even with the rain washing the ground, it was impossible to deny the freshness of those marks. Whether or not to follow that trail became an inevitable choice, for with each flash of lightning that illuminated the cemetery, I had the feeling that the footprints weren't just inviting me forward, but rather drawing me toward a secret that was about to be revealed. With slow steps and heavy breathing, I began to follow that impossible trail, each mark in the mud guiding me. Between the sodden graves, the flashlight trembled in my hand, not only from the instability of the rain lashing my face, but from the psychological weight that grew with every meter I walked. The footprints followed one another like a silent call, and I couldn't help but feel as if I was being led by something fully aware of its path. The contrast between the sound of the rain hitting the ground and the profound silence that settled within me put me in a constant state of alert, as if my very senses were being manipulated by the environment. The trail led straight to a specific spot in the cemetery, where the earth still seemed darker and newer. It was then that I recognized the spot. It was the grave of a young woman who had been buried the day before, the victim of a tragic accident that had shaken the entire town. I still remembered her face at the wake, marked by the cold pallor of death and the incessant tears of her family, who watched the farewell under a weight of unbearable a grief. Now, faced with the rain that pelted the ground, it was precisely that grave that awaited me, as if it had been chosen to carry an even crueler secret. What disturbed me most, however, was not only seeing that the footprints originated from exactly there, but also realizing that they didn't just lead outward. After a few meters, I noticed that the trail curved back, returning to the same grave from which it had emerged, as if whatever had walked through the storm had hesitated, decided to leave for just a moment, and then immediately returned to the earth that was supposed to keep it in eternal silence. And it was at that moment, faced with this impossible contradiction, that my mind began to crumble, because I couldn't accept that there was something leaving and returning to a tomb, as if death had lost its authority and the cemetery itself held a restless visitor. I stood before that grave, feeling the cold rain running down my face like melting ice, but unable to tear my eyes away from the trail that came and went, like a silent confession etched in the clay. I had seen many strange things in my work, stories that spread in whispers through the corridors of funeral homes, or came to life in conversations between veteran gravediggers, but nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the cruel paradox unfolding before me. The footprints bespoke an exit, a breaking through the barriers of death, but they also revealed a voluntary, almost melancholic return, as if whatever had risen from the coffin had hesitated in the darkness and chosen to return to the earth. The psychological conflict that arose within me was devastating. Part of me desperately tried to cling to a logical explanation, like the possibility of vandalism or some macabre prank by young people who invaded the cemetery to mock the mourning of others. But none of these hypotheses could withstand the detail that crushed me. The rain would have erased any human trace in a matter of minutes. And yet those footprints remained there, perfect, as if the storm itself refused to touch them. It was as if the rain washed the entire cemetery clean, but preserved only that trace, as if trying to force me to see. The longer I stared at the grave, the more the feeling that a presence was trapped within intensified. It was a fear that came not only from what my eyes saw, but from what my mind tried unsuccessfully to comprehend. A feeling that the young woman had not accepted her condition and remained oscillating between worlds, unable to decide whether to leave or stay. And as this thought gnawed at me, the next clap of thunder ripped through the sky, momentarily illuminating the wet tombstone, and I swear for a split second, I felt as if something moved underground, as if the clay were breathing. I approached the grave with hesitant steps, feeling every muscle in my body begging me to retreat, but there was something irresistible pushing me forward, as if an invisible force were pulling me by the chest toward the tomb. The rain pounded the ground, turning the mud into a viscous mass that stuck to my boots, making movement difficult. But even that wasn't enough to quell the urgent need to confirm if what I'd seen was real. I tilted the flashlight to better illuminate the ground and realized the marks were even more evident there, as if they'd been carved with intention, each toe imprinted with disturbing clarity, each curve of the foot betraying that they weren't the result of chance or erosion. It was at that moment that the feeling of being alone completely disappeared. The air around me seemed denser, heavier, as if an invisible presence had filled the space between me and the grave. The sound of the rain, which had been constant until then, seemed to become distant, muffled, as if someone had drawn a veil over the surroundings, so I could hear something deeper, something that came not from above, but from below. I clutched the flashlight tightly, trembling when a dull, almost imperceptible crack seemed to rise from within the grave, as if wood had broken or something had scraped against the coffin walls. My heart raced so hard that for a moment I thought I might faint. But fear kept me conscious, trapped in the anticipation of hearing that sound again. The next clap of thunder echoed violently, illuminating the cemetery for a second, and in that flash I saw the earth tremble slightly, as if breathing beneath my feet. In that instant, I understood that I wasn't just looking at inexplicable footprints, but at something still there, restless, trying to manifest itself amidst the storm. I stood motionless before that grave, my breath caught in my throat, as if the air itself had become too heavy to breathe. The rain continued to fall, but I no longer felt it on my skin, because all my attention was fixed on that patch of earth that seemed to pulse silently, guarding a secret that should never be revealed. I waited for another crack, for a more obvious movement, but what came was even worse, a dense, suffocating silence that seemed to expand within me, forcing me to face the fact that I would never be able to explain what I had witnessed. The footprints, so clear and impossible, were now etched not only in the mud, but also in my memory, and I knew they would accompany me for the rest of my life. I looked one last time at the young woman's grave, and felt as if something were watching me from within, as if invisible. Eyes were staring at me through the darkness and wet earth. Retreating was a belated but necessary instinct, because I understood there was nothing more I could do there than carry with me the memory of that death-defying trail. I returned to the guardhouse without looking back, but since that night I've known that the rain will never again be just rain, for it will always bring me back to the dawn when I understood that some dead do not rest in peace. They merely hesitate between staying or leaving. Have you ever wondered what you would do if, upon opening an ancient tomb, expecting to find the silent remains of someone buried decades ago, you found only an empty coffin, its boards split from the inside out, as if the body had decided it would not remain there? It's easy to believe that death is an absolute end, a definitive line separating the living from the dead. But some stories have the power to shake that certainty and leave us with the terrifying feeling that the earth may hold. Secrets far more disturbing than we imagine. I always believed that nothing could surprise me after so many years dealing with graves, wakes, and farewells. I lived with the weight of the silence of cemeteries, learned to differentiate the sound of the wind from the distant sound of footsteps, and saw many people try to hide their tears behind hard looks. But in all my life as a gravedigger, I could never have imagined that the most terrifying experience would happen just as I was about to retire, as if the cemetery itself had saved the darkest story to present to me at the end of my career. The night I found that moss-covered tomb seemed unremarkable, and yet I carry with me to this day the feeling that something was already lurking, ready to reveal itself. Because when I saw the footprints in the mud leading from within a forgotten grave, I realized there was no possible preparation for what awaited me. And it is precisely this memory that haunts me to this day, the image of an empty coffin that still haunts me, not for what I found, but for what I never discovered. Like and subscribe now, because what you've heard is just the beginning. Future stories will bring even more disturbing revelations that cannot be ignored. I've spent most of my life surrounded by death, learning to respect the silence of cemeteries as one who lives daily with an inescapable presence. I started young, when physical strength was needed to dig the heavy earth, and over time I acquired the serenity of someone who understands that each open grave represents not only the end of a life, but also a chapter in stories that will remain buried forever. I've seen families fall apart in front of closed caskets, witnessed farewells too quickly, filled with regret, and also observed wakes where silence spoke louder than any words. Carrying these memories has shaped who I am, and strangely enough, I've learned to find a kind of peace in the routine of dealing with what everyone prefers to avoid. As the years passed, I became a nearly invisible figure in the community, someone many greeted politely, but few dared to look at for long. After all, no one likes to be constantly reminded of finitude, and I was precisely the symbol of this inevitable reminder. About to retire, I believed I'd seen it all. Bodies disfigured by accidents, graves desecrated by vandals, and even stories of family members fighting beside the newly dug grave. Still, I never imagined that one final experience could drag me into an abyss of such profound doubts capable of eroding the little peace I'd gained. And it was precisely when I began working in an old part of the cemetery, forgotten by most and feared by some, that I realized that the past was not as dormant as it seemed. The old part of the cemetery always had a distinct atmosphere, almost as if it carried an invisible weight that seeped into the skin of anyone who dared to walk there. The headstones were covered in moss, some tilted by time, others already nameless, erased by rain and oblivion. Twisted trees cast shadows that mingled with human figures, and at night, under the pale moon, this area seemed more like a stage for abandoned memories than a place of eternal rest. Older townspeople whispered in hushed tones about strange stories associated with this section, and while many dismissed these tales as local legends, I knew there was a grain of truth to every rumor. Some said that bodies buried there in decades past never rested in their proper places, as if the dead in that wing carried a restlessness that prevented them from remaining underground. Others spoke of figures moving among the rusted crosses during storms, and there were also reports of footsteps heard on moonless nights, coming from precisely where no visitor should be. For years, I listened to these stories with a mixture of disbelief and respect. After all, when you work in a cemetery, you learn that fear is also part of the routine. Still, that night, as the clouds gathered and the wind whistled through the ancient trees, I felt that all those stories that seemed distant were about to materialize before me, as if the cemetery had chosen the perfect moment to reveal what it had kept secret. And it was during this solitary round, guided only by the dim light of the lantern and the sound of the wind, that my eyes finally found something I will never forget. As I walked among those ancient graves, illuminating the path with my flashlight, barely able to pierce the heavy darkness, I noticed a detail that immediately made my heart race. The damp ground, covered with a thin layer of decaying leaves, bore marks that shouldn't have been there. I approached cautiously, believing at first they were merely animal tracks, perhaps from a lost dog or some nocturnal visitor who had dared to cross the closed gates. However, as I looked more closely, I felt a shiver run down my spine, for before me were human footprints, clear as if bare feet had pressed into the soft earth, leaving deep, fresh impressions. Most disturbing was the fact that the marks didn't originate from any logical point, not from the gate, nor from any of the main paths. They emerged from within a specific grave, covered in moss, its headstone tilted and nearly illegible from the wear of time. The footprints led from there, in a straight line, as if someone had emerged from the earth and walked calmly toward the center of the cemetery. I angled the flashlight over. The spot and the beam revealed the clarity of the contours, each toe imprinted in the mud, each deeper heel mark indicating the weight of a body that had risen. There was no sign of intrusion, nor of anyone digging over it. Everything indicated that the marks had been made from the inside out. In that instant, I felt the world around me shrink, as if every shadow around me was silently watching me, waiting for my reaction to something I should never have seen. I remained paralyzed, torn between fleeing and moving even closer. But before I could make any decision, the sound of my own breathing reminded me that I wasn't dreaming. I truly was facing an impossible trail, and it was only the beginning of what was about to unfold. The next morning, still shaken by the discovery of those footprints that seemed to have emerged from the very womb of the earth, I decided to report what had happened to the cemetery administrator, a practical, dry-spoken man who had always treated my concerns with a mixture of skepticism and disdain. As I described what I had seen, I noticed his hardened gaze, as if he were assessing whether I had finally lost my mind after so many years of living with death. However, there was something in the tone of my voice, perhaps the weight of conviction, or the way my eyes refused to look away, that prevented him from dismissing my account completely. After a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, he sighed deeply and decided it would be necessary to check the grave. His decision felt like an inevitable sentence. He ordered me to open the tomb, claiming that if there were footprints, we needed a plausible explanation. I tried to argue that it was beyond my scope of duty, that it was something that shouldn't be disturbed, but his inflexible expression left me with no choice. It was as if the weight of decades of work had converged on that moment, forcing me to face something I never wanted to witness. As I walked back to the old section, carrying the tools I had so often used almost automatically, I felt each step like a slow march towards something that could shake not only my mind, but also the very notion of reality that underpinned my profession. The cemetery was silent, the wind seemed subdued, and even the trees that normally groaned in the breeze seemed still, as if awaiting the unfolding of what was to come. I knew that as I placed the shovel in the earth of that grave, there would be no turning back, and what was revealed there could forever mark the final days of my life as a gravedigger. With the shovel firmly in my hands, I began to remove the damp layer of earth covering that forgotten tomb, each blow heavier than any other excavation I had ever undertaken. The smell of wet earth mingled with the sweet odor of decaying vegetation, creating a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to penetrate my skin and settle in my lungs. Time seemed to drag, and the silence was so intense that even the metallic sound of the shovel entering the earth sounded like a distant echo in a space that should not be disturbed. With each inch removed, the feeling that something was watching me intensified, as if invisible forces silently awaited the moment I reached that which should remain sealed. When I finally touched the wood of the coffin, my breath caught for a moment. The wood was damp, brittle, covered in fungus and scarred by time, but what really made me shudder was its condition. The boards weren't intact, as one would expect after decades underground. They were broken, not by external pressure, but as if something from within had pushed violently until the structure gave way. I shoved my flashlight through the cracks, and the beam revealed a disturbing void, a space that should have housed human remains, but now held nothing but darkness. That absence was far more frightening than any sight of bones or decaying fragments. It was a silence that screamed, a confirmation that something had happened there, and that the body was no longer where it should have been. Staring at that empty space, I felt my stomach churn and my mind implode with unanswered questions, for the most terrifying doubt wasn't what was missing from the coffin, but rather where what should have been there had gone. The emptiness of that coffin was a puzzle that corroded not only logic, but also my sanity, for faced with that absence, every plausible explanation crumbled as if made of sand. I knew that bones don't evaporate, that decades of decomposition leave inevitable traces, fragments, dust, something that attests to the passage of time. Yet before my eyes, there was only wood split from the inside out, and a darkness that seemed to expand beyond physical space, as if it were less a coffin and more a portal opened by invisible hands. The idea that someone could have violated the tomb at some point in history sounded tenuous, because no intruder would have left the boards in that state, as if the escape had originated from within. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear and the morbid fascination of discovery, I felt my conscience weigh under the burden of a question that imposed itself mercilessly. Where had the body gone? If decades ago someone had been buried in that space, why was only emptiness now left? With every heartbeat, I imagined possibilities I dared not voice aloud. The body could be walking among the living, invisible and forgotten, or perhaps it was trapped in some in-between space, condemned to wander aimlessly, leaving only footprints as a testament to its restlessness. Most disturbing was the thought that those marks in the clay were not a metaphor, but a real record that something had left there, walked among us, and somehow disappeared into time. This absence became more terrifying than any sight of bones, because it carried with it a suffocating certainty. If that body was no longer there, it could be anywhere, perhaps even closer than I dared imagine. And it was with this crushing thought that I understood that the horror lay not in the tomb, but in the fact that the missing person could still be nearby, silent, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself again. Since that day, I've never been able to look at the cemetery the same way again, because I understood that behind the apparent order of the aligned graves lies a reality that challenges everything we believe about death. I retired a few weeks later, unable to continue walking among graves that no longer represented rest, but rather open doors to secrets that should never be revealed. The empty coffin lingered in my mind like a wound that wouldn't heal, and every time I close my eyes, I see the broken boards again, hear the suffocating silence of the earth, and feel the heavy absence of the body that should have been there. There was never an official explanation, no clues were found, and the tomb was eventually closed again, as if nothing had happened, but I know nothing will ever be normal again after what I witnessed. Today, every time I hear footsteps in the night or feel the rain beat against the window, I remember that there are bodies that never rest, stories that remain unfinished, and presences that wander aimlessly. You might think it's all just the ravings of an old gravedigger about to retire, but just remember the image of an empty coffin to understand that there are secrets the earth cannot hide. If you also believe that some stories deserve to be heard until the end, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are still many disturbing stories waiting to be revealed.